You're nothing but a fraud, a pathetic old man playing dress-up. Margaret Chen's voice echoed through the crowded coffee shop as she pointed an accusatory finger at the elderly man sitting quietly in the corner. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his worn military cap, the silver eagle pin catching the morning light. People like you disgust me, pretending to be something you're not for attention and discounts. The entire cafe fell silent. Customers stopped mid-sip. Baristas paused their work, and all eyes turned to the confrontation unfolding before them. The old man, dressed in a faded but clean uniform jacket, simply looked down at his coffee cup, saying nothing. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where we uncover the remarkable tales of ordinary people whose extraordinary moments remind us of the power of respect, dignity, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Today's story will show you why assumptions can be dangerous, why respect should never be conditional, and how one woman's cruel words would come back to haunt her in the most unexpected way. Let's uncover what really happened when Margaret Chen decided to publicly humiliate a man she knew nothing about, and how the truth would eventually surface in a courtroom that would fall silent at the sound of his name. Margaret Chen had always considered herself a pillar of the community. At 42, she was a successful real estate agent, president of the local homeowners association, and someone who prided herself on calling out what she perceived as injustice. But her definition of justice was often skewed by her own biases and quick judgments. That Tuesday morning started like any other for Margaret. She had arrived at Sunrise Coffee early for a meeting with potential clients when she noticed the elderly man in military attire. Something about his quiet demeanor and worn uniform triggered her suspicion. In her mind, real veterans were either loud and proud or clearly marked with obvious signs of their service. This man seemed too humble, too quiet, too ordinary. The old man, whose name was Henry Morrison, had simply wanted a peaceful cup of coffee before his appointment. At 78, he had learned to keep to himself, avoiding confrontation whenever possible. His uniform jacket, though aged, was meticulously maintained, each button polished, each crease sharp. The weight of memories it carried was invisible to those around him. Margaret's accusations grew louder and more vicious. I bet you bought that uniform at a thrift store. You probably never even served a day in your life. She pulled out her phone, threatening to record him and post it online. The world needs to see what stolen valor looks like. Other customers began to murmur uncomfortably. Some pulled out their own phones, unsure whether to record the confrontation or call for help. The young barista behind the counter looked helplessly between Margaret and Henry, clearly wanting to intervene, but unsure how. Henry finally looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Margaret's fierce gaze. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but I assure you, I have every right to wear this uniform." His voice was steady but quiet, dignified despite the public humiliation. "Prove it then," Margaret demanded, her voice reaching a crescendo. "Where's your ID? Where are your medals? Real veterans carry proof." "I don't need to prove anything to you," Henry replied simply, standing up slowly, his arthritis making the movement difficult. He placed a $5 bill on the table, far more than his coffee cost, and began to walk toward the door. But Margaret wasn't finished. She followed him, her voice carrying across the now silent cafe. "That's what I thought. Running away because you know you're a fake." She turned to address the other customers. "This is what's wrong with our society. People lying about military service for sympathy and discounts." Henry paused at the door, his hand on the handle. For a moment, it seemed he might turn around and say something, but instead he simply walked out into the cool morning air, leaving behind a cafe full of uncomfortable witnesses and one very satisfied Margaret Chen. What Margaret didn't know was that Henry Morrison was headed to the courthouse, where he served as a volunteer coordinator for veterans' legal aid services. He had been doing this quietly for over a decade, helping younger veterans navigate the complex legal system. connecting them with resources and providing the kind of support he wished he had received when he returned from service. The incident at the coffee shop weighed heavily on Henry's mind as he walked the 6 blocks to the courthouse. He had faced worse humiliation in his life, far worse, but something about the public nature of the attack and the assumption that he was seeking undeserved sympathy stung deeply. At the courthouse, Henry threw himself into his work, helping 3 different veterans that morning with everything from disability claims to housing disputes. His quiet competence and deep knowledge of military bureaucracy made him invaluable to both the veterans he served and the legal aid attorneys who worked with him. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen was riding high on what she perceived as her victory. She had posted about the incident on social media, describing how she had exposed a fake veteran. The post gained traction in her local community groups, with some people praising her for her vigilance while others questioned whether she had gone too far. But Margaret's satisfaction would be short-lived. 3 days after the coffee shop incident, she found herself in legal trouble of her own. A business deal she had been working on had gone sour, and the other party was claiming she had misrepresented property conditions. The matter was serious enough to require legal mediation, and Margaret found herself needing to appear at the very courthouse where Henry volunteered. The mediation was scheduled for the following week, but Margaret's attorney suggested they arrive early to meet with a veterans legal aid coordinator who had experience with property law and could provide additional insight into her case. Margaret, despite her recent behavior, was desperate enough to accept any help offered. When Margaret walked into the veterans legal aid office at the courthouse, she stopped dead in her tracks. Behind a modest desk, wearing a simple button-down shirt and reading glasses, sat Henry Morrison. He looked up from the case file he was reviewing, and their eyes met. The recognition was immediate and mutual. Margaret's face flushed red, a mixture of embarrassment and defiance coloring her cheeks. Henry's expression remained neutral, professional, though a flicker of something unreadable passed across his features. "Mrs. Chen, I presume," Henry said quietly, standing up and extending his hand. "I'm Henry Morrison, and I'll be coordinating your case today." Margaret hesitated, unsure whether to take his hand or flee the room entirely. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. The man she had publicly humiliated was now in a position to help her with her legal troubles. "I think there's been a mistake," Margaret stammered. "I was told I'd be meeting with a veterans legal coordinator, not—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without admitting her own prejudices. "Not what, Mrs. Chen?" Henry asked gently, his tone devoid of the anger or satisfaction she might have expected. "Not someone who looks like they belong here. Not someone whose service you questioned 3 days ago in front of a room full of strangers." The weight of her actions suddenly felt crushing. Margaret sank into the chair across from Henry's desk, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I don't understand. You're really a veteran?" Henry sat back down, his movements deliberate and patient. "Mrs. Chen, I served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1967 and 1970. I was part of the 1st Cavalry Division, 7th Cavalry Regiment. I saw things that no human being should ever have to see, and I did things that I still carry with me every single day." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside were his discharge papers, commendation letters, and a faded photograph of a much younger Henry in full military dress. "I don't carry these for strangers in coffee shops, Mrs. Chen. I carry them because sometimes I need to remind myself that I survived when so many others didn't." Margaret stared at the documents, her hands shaking as she processed the reality of her mistake. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I assumed—" "You assumed that veterans look a certain way, act a certain way, and need to prove themselves to anyone who questions them," Henry said, his voice still calm but carrying an undercurrent of pain. "You assumed that because I was quiet and humble, I must be lying about my service?" The room fell silent as Margaret grappled with the enormity of her error. She had not only misjudged an innocent man, but had publicly humiliated a genuine war veteran who had dedicated his post-service life to helping others. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "After what I did to you, why would you even speak to me, let alone help with my legal problems?" Henry closed the folder and placed it back in his drawer. "Because that's what we do, Mrs. Chen. We serve others, even when they don't deserve it, even when they've wronged us. It's not about you or what you did to me. It's about doing what's right." For the next hour, Henry worked diligently on Margaret's case, providing insights and connections that proved invaluable to her legal strategy. His professionalism never wavered, despite the personal history between them. As their meeting concluded, Margaret felt compelled to address the elephant in the room. "Mr. Morrison, I need to make this right somehow. What I did was inexcusable, and I want to apologize properly, publicly if necessary." Henry studied her face for a long moment, looking for sincerity in her words. "Mrs. Chen, apologies are meaningless without changed behavior. If you truly want to make amends, perhaps you could consider volunteering here, helping veterans who are facing legal challenges. Learn about the people you so quickly judged." Margaret nodded eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to redeem herself. "Yes, absolutely. I'll do whatever it takes." But Henry wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know, Mrs. Chen, something that might help you understand why your words that day were particularly painful." He opened another drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were several military medals, including a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. "I received these not for being loud or proud, but for being willing to sacrifice everything for my fellow soldiers." The Bronze Star was for pulling 3 wounded men from a burning helicopter under enemy fire. The Purple Heart was for the shrapnel that's still embedded in my back from that day. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the medals. "Why don't you wear them? Why don't you tell people about this?" "Because real heroism doesn't need an audience, Mrs. Chen. The men who didn't come home, they're the real heroes. I'm just someone who was lucky enough to survive and foolish enough to think that 40 years later, I could grab a quiet cup of coffee without being called a fraud." The weight of Henry's words settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She realized that her actions hadn't just hurt one man. They had dishonored the memory of every veteran who had served quietly, humbly, without fanfare or recognition. As Margaret prepared to leave, Henry stood up once more. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to remember something. The next time you see someone and make assumptions about who they are or what they've done, remember this moment. Remember that every person you encounter is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying burdens you can't see, and deserving of basic human dignity, regardless of whether they meet your expectations." Margaret nodded, understanding the profound lesson she had been taught. "I will, Mr. Morrison. I promise I will." True to her word, Margaret began volunteering at the Veterans Legal Aid Office the following week. She worked alongside Henry, learning not just about the legal challenges veterans faced, but about the quiet dignity with which so many of them carried their service. Over the months that followed, Margaret discovered stories that humbled her daily. She met veterans who had served in conflicts she had never heard of, who had made sacrifices that never made the news, who had returned home to build quiet, meaningful lives without fanfare or recognition. She learned that heroism often looked like Henry Morrison, humble, quiet, dedicated to service long after the uniform was hung up. She realized that her preconceived notions about how veterans should look, act, and present themselves had been not just wrong, but deeply harmful. 6 months after their first encounter, Margaret and Henry were working together on a particularly complex case involving a homeless veteran who had been wrongfully evicted. As they prepared for the court hearing, Margaret reflected on how much her perspective had changed. "Henry," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something. That day in the coffee shop, You could have told everyone who you were. You could have shown them your medals, your service record. Why didn't you defend yourself? Henry looked up from the case file he was reviewing. Margaret, I spent 3 years in Vietnam watching young men die for their country. When I came home, I was spit on, called a baby killer, told I was part of an evil war machine. I learned that day that some people will always find reasons to diminish your service, your sacrifice, your worth. I decided long ago that I wouldn't waste my energy trying to prove my value to people who had already decided I had none. But it must have hurt, Margaret insisted. My words, they must have brought back those painful memories. They did, Henry admitted. But you know what hurt more? The fact that in 40 years we apparently haven't learned to treat each other with basic respect. That we still judge people based on our own narrow expectations rather than giving them the dignity they deserve as human beings. Margaret felt the familiar sting of shame, but also something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that Henry had chosen to teach rather than punish, to guide rather than reject, to show mercy when she had shown none. The court hearing that day was a success. The homeless veteran's eviction was ruled improper, and he was awarded damages that would help him get back on his feet. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Margaret and Henry were approached by a young reporter who had been covering the case. "Mr. Morrison," the reporter said, "I understand you coordinate the Veterans Legal Aid program here. Our readers would love to know more about your background, your service record." Henry smiled politely but shook his head. "I appreciate the interest, but the story isn't about me. It's about the veterans we serve, the challenges they face, and the community that supports them. If you want to write something meaningful, tell their stories." As the reporter walked away, Margaret marveled at Henry's consistent humility. Even when offered a platform to share his heroic service, he deflected attention to others. It was a lesson in leadership that no business school or self-help book could have taught her. That evening, Margaret sat in her home office, staring at a blank social media post. She wanted to share what she had learned, to somehow make amends for her initial post about the fake veteran she had encountered. But every word she typed seemed inadequate to capture the depth of her transformation. Finally, she wrote simply, "I learned something important today about assumptions, dignity, and the quiet heroes who walk among us. Before you judge someone, remember that you don't know their story, their struggles, or their sacrifices. Respect isn't something people have to earn from you. It's something you owe them as a fellow human being." She tagged it with a note about volunteering opportunities at the Veterans Legal Aid Office, hoping that others might find the same path to understanding that Henry had provided her. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People shared their own stories of misjudgment and redemption, of veterans in their own lives who served quietly and humbly. Margaret realized that Henry's lesson had rippled far beyond their personal encounter. A year later, Margaret had become one of the most dedicated volunteers in the Veterans Legal Aid program. She had helped dozens of veterans navigate complex legal challenges, and in the process had developed genuine friendships with people she once might have overlooked or misjudged. At the program's annual recognition dinner, Margaret was surprised to find herself called to the podium to receive an award for volunteer service. As she looked out at the audience of veterans, legal professionals, and community supporters, she caught Henry's eye. He was smiling, not with pride in her recognition, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed and watched it grow into something beautiful. "This award doesn't belong to me," Margaret said into the microphone. "It belongs to a man who taught me that true strength is measured not by how loudly you proclaim your worth, but by how quietly you serve others. It belongs to every veteran who has chosen patience over anger, teaching over punishment, and service over self-promotion." She paused, looking directly at Henry. "It belongs to the man I once called a fake veteran, who responded to my cruelty with kindness, my ignorance with education, and my judgment with grace. Henry Morrison showed me that heroism isn't always found on battlefields. Sometimes it's found in courthouse offices, coffee shops, and the everyday moments when we choose to lift each other up instead of tear each other down. The audience erupted in applause, but Henry simply nodded once, his expression unchanged. For him, this wasn't about recognition or vindication. It was about the mission accomplished, another person transformed from judgment to understanding. As the evening wound down, Margaret approached Henry one final time. "I have something I need to say to you, something I should have said that very first day in your office." Henry waited patiently, as he always did. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, even when I had shown you nothing but disrespect. Thank you for teaching me that the measure of a person isn't in their uniform or their medals or their ability to prove themselves to strangers. It's in their willingness to serve others, to show mercy, and to believe in the possibility of redemption." Henry shook her hand, the same gesture he had offered that first day in his office, but this time Margaret understood its significance. It wasn't just a handshake. It was an offer of partnership, of shared purpose, of belief in the fundamental dignity of every human being. Today, Margaret Chen continues to volunteer at the Veterans Legal Aid Office, where she has helped hundreds of veterans navigate complex legal challenges. She speaks regularly at community events about the dangers of assumption and the power of second chances, and every morning she stops by Sunrise Coffee, where she has become known not as the woman who humiliated a veteran, but as someone who learned from her mistakes and dedicated her life to making amends. Henry Morrison, now 80 years old, still coordinates the Veterans Legal Aid Program, still serves his community with the same quiet dignity that has defined his entire life. He carries his medals not for show, but as reminders of the brothers who didn't come home, and he wears his service not as a badge of honor, but as a commitment to continue serving others. The lesson of their story resonates far beyond that courthouse, far beyond that coffee shop confrontation. It reminds us that respect should never be conditional, that dignity belongs to every person, regardless of how they present themselves to the world, and that the most profound transformations often come not from punishment, but from patience, understanding, and the radical act of choosing to believe in someone's capacity for change. In a world that often rewards quick judgments and public shaming, Henry Morrison and Margaret Chen's story stands as a testament to the power of quiet heroism, second chances, and the understanding that every person we encounter is fighting battles we know nothing about. Their journey from confrontation to collaboration, from judgment to understanding, reminds us that sometimes the most important victories happen not in the moment of conflict, but in the years of service that follow. Remember their story the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances, assumptions, or your own narrow expectations. Remember that true strength often looks like humility, that real heroism rarely announces itself, and that the person you dismiss today might be the one who teaches you the most important lesson of your life tomorrow.